Well, good evening, everyone. We are a full house tonight. What a great reason to celebrate a terrific panel, and also, I'm told, the first official event following the opening of this beautiful venue, and La Trobe is here, I'm very proud to say. My name is Professor Kerry Lee Krause. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic at La Trobe University, and it is my great pleasure to welcome each and every one of you here today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting this evening. And in the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge all members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who are with us in the audience this evening, and indeed pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce tonight's Ideas and Society event. It promises to be a lively debate on the topic of feminism. As I mentioned, it is sold out, and what a beautiful venue to enjoy this evening and to engage in a very lively discussion, no doubt. Our Vice-Chancellor's Fellow Emeritus Professor Robert Mann has been running the Ideas and Society program since 2010. Rob has created a forum for intelligent and thought-provoking discussion of some of the most important and arguably some of the most polarizing issues that we face as a nation and as a global community. So we're very proud to be able to host tonight's event and to provide a platform for this important dialogue to take place. Tonight we have 4 strong female voices on the platform. Each of them will bring their own perspective and experience on the feminism movement. I'll introduce each of them in just a moment, but first let me make a few personal remarks and remarks on behalf of La Trobe University. The topic of feminism is very important to me in the context of gender equality in higher education. Across higher education institutions here in this country and indeed internationally, we see gendered patterns of participation on all levels, but for a moment I'll talk about our academic staff, our faculty. Women are generally well represented in junior positions. Just over 50% of science, technology, engineering, mathematics and medicine junior academics are female, and in other disciplines such as humanities, education, business, law, the numbers are a little higher in the earlier career levels. Around 59% of junior academics are female, but disappointingly right across our institutions, women are significantly underrepresented at more senior academic levels. For example, only 20% of senior academics in the science disciplines are female, and it's only slightly better for academics in the humanities, sitting at around 30% representation of women. And still we have a long way to go to reach gender parity at the most senior level of Vice-Chancellor in universities. So I'm very pleased to say that given that we have a number of challenges on our hands within the university sector, the university that I'm representing here, La Trobe University, is very proud to be taking proactive action. Let me give you a couple of examples. In February 2019, La Trobe was awarded another citation from the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, WGEA. Many of you will know this program for employer of choice for gender equality. This is our 3rd consecutive year of being awarded this citation, which is designed to encourage, recognise and promote active commitments to achieve gender equality in Australian workplaces. We're part of a broader movement to address gender-based disparity as one of 140 Australian organisations to receive a citation this year. This citation recognises the efforts to support gender equity, and its criteria include looking at representation of women in leadership roles right across the organisation, gender remuneration gaps, a big one for all organisations, flexible working and other initiatives to support family responsibilities, and preventing sex-based harassment and discrimination, to name just a few. In the area of STEM, I'm very pleased to say that, like many other universities in the country, we have recently signed up for accreditation within the SAGE program, looking specifically at gender equity in science in Australian universities. This program seeks to encourage women, trans and gender diverse people to participate in science, technology, engineering, mathematics and medicine by addressing systemic barriers to equity. We recognise that these issues are at the heart of the work that is not limited to sciences but crosses all aspects of the workplace, both in universities as well as more broadly. With all that said, though, I'd like to start with a very warm welcome to our discussants this evening. Tonight we will hear from Clementine Ford, Teela Reid and Petra Blueskins. Following their presentations, Claire Wright will moderate a panel and then open up to questions from the audience, so please do make sure that you're prepared for those. Let me tell you a little bit more about our esteemed panel this evening. Clementine Ford will be known to many of you as a feminist author and public speaker. She's author of the best-selling books Fight Like a Girl and Boys Will Be Boys. She was the recipient of the Matt Rochelle Award for the Best New Writer of the Year at the 2017 Australian Book Industry Awards. Teela Reid is a Wiradjuri and Walwyn woman, lawyer and human rights advocate. She is a solicitor with experience practicing in criminal, civil and administrative law. Teela was the first Aboriginal person to be elected on the University of New South Wales Law Society as Vice President Social Justice, where she was the founding director of the UNSW Law First Peoples Moot. She was also the inaugural recipient of the New South Wales Indigenous Barristers Trust Award. Petra Blueskins is an honorary fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. She's the founder and principal psychotherapist at PPMD Therapy and occasional op-ed writer. She's an international expert in the sociology of motherhood, feminist social theory, psychoanalysis, and psychotherapy. And finally, to top off this very impressive panel, let me introduce our chair for this evening, La Trobe's own Dr. Claire Wright. She's an award-winning historian, author, broadcaster, public commentator. She's worked in politics, academia, and the media. Among her many achievements, let me name just one. Her best-selling book, The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka, won the 2014 Stella Prize and the NIB Literary Award and People's Choice Award. There's much, much more to say and to learn about these women, but let's get on with hearing from them. Please join me in welcoming Claire to the stage.
Thank you, Carrie Ann. And thank you all for coming tonight. It is a magnificent sold-out crowd of over 600 in this beautifully restored new theatre. Anybody would think people are interested in talking about feminism. And I'd also like to thank Robert Mann for inviting me to moderate the discussion tonight. It's indeed a rare occasion when there are exclusively female voices on stage, particularly such a prominent stage, and particularly on the topic of politics. For when we're discussing feminism, we are, of course, discussing politics. I too would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose country we're meeting tonight. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I recognise that this land has always been the place for the discussion and dissemination of political ideas, that this land was stolen and that sovereignty was never ceded. Before we begin, I'd like to quickly introduce myself beyond the sort of bio that Carrie Ann has given me. I am a Polish, Russian, Jewish, Scots, Presbyterian American woman who came to Australia as a first-generation migrant in 1974 when I was 5 years old. For the past 45 years, I have lived in Melbourne on Wurundjeri land. My pronouns are she, her. And for those who can't see me, I am white and able-bodied. I'm a proud union member, a Republican, a wife and a mother. And I'm an historian with a particular expertise in the history of women's political activism in Australia. I don't quite know whether I'm checking my privilege here or saving SBS the bother of having to do a who do you think you are. But I'm introducing myself like this tonight by way of illustrating that each of us here in the room tonight, male, female, intersex, trans, fluid or non-binary, comes from a subject position that is informed by multiple identities. My feminism, my way of being in the world as somebody who is an advocate of equal rights and opportunities and social justice for women, my feminism both cleaves to and rebels against this complex psychological and sociological architecture of identity. So how can there not be different voices within feminism when feminism itself is a collective movement for social change? We're all in this together, and yet none of us is the same. So tonight we're going to hear from three of the most powerful, engaged and enraged of these voices. And we're going to hear from them first as soloists, and each of our speakers will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then, as Kerry-Ann said, I'm going to facilitate a panel discussion. Now, I'm not expecting us necessarily to harmonise, but who knows? Our menstrual cycles may have already synced just sitting here already. Or we might just end up having a good cry and discussing what we've been watching on Netflix recently. Does anybody have any wine? I've got this card on my office door that somebody sent me. It's two women having a chat, and it says, Cecily and her friends found that wine, women and more wine could sort anything. So I apologise to those who are no longer menstruating and don't drink. So I'll check that privilege there as well. So finally, there will be about half an hour for your own questions to the speakers. And you will have seen that our friends at Readings are selling books out the front here tonight, so there's also a chance for you to purchase books and have them signed. So that's it for me for a while. The first of our speakers that I'd like to ask to come up to the lectern is Clementine Ford. Please welcome Clementine.
I've known you for so many years, Claire. It's Clementine.
But do I have an I in my name or not?
In my phone, you do.
Well, I don't.
I realised today.
We're equal.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on the stolen land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Sovereignty was never ceded. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and commit also to helping to dismantle the structures of white supremacy and my own participation in that system. Feminism, yes, but what kind of feminism and what is yet to be achieved? Over the last week, I've approached this question with trepidation and a not insignificant amount of insecurity. I'm well aware that within the patriarchal system we live in, I still experience enormous benefit. I'm cisgender, white, middle class, university educated, and able-bodied. I'm conscious of avoiding the blinkered perspective of the kind of feminism that seeks to achieve equality only between privileged white women and white men. I don't always succeed in unpacking the reality of my privilege, but I do consider it to be an ongoing responsibility rather than a decision I can make to define myself as good. Goodness is not a static state of being, but a target towards which we must always be striving towards. But I do think that there's one topic on which I can speak with some sort of authority, primarily because I've spent so many years writing about it, and that's the topic of rape culture. And before I go any further as well, I should offer the disclaimer that there will be some descriptive elements of this talk, and there is also mention of a deceased Aboriginal person. What we can do differently within that dialogue to prevent boys and men from being perpetrators of it. For a long time, the thought of educating boys away from rape culture was largely theoretical for me. Practical and personal, obviously, in the sense that I am a woman who has been affected, as we all have to varying degrees, by rape culture, but theoretical in terms of my interest in engaging with men about it. But then I gave birth to a child who was assigned male, and it became starkly obvious to me that I had an immediate responsibility to understand how boys are indoctrinated into this system and how I could do my best to prevent him from joining them. There are many things that people find challenging about feminist activism, but rape culture continues to be one of the most confronting and difficult topics, at least in my experience. Although a growing number of people in the mainstream are prepared to accept the reality that rape culture exists, there are still far too many who willfully resist understanding the concept altogether. Reactions prompted by discussions of rape culture invariably include exclamations like, "Rape culture isn't real. How can anyone be taught to rape?" And, my favourite, "Everyone hates rapists." Not to mention the enthusiastic racism that's seized on as well by people who like to think that rape is something that only happens outside this country, perpetrated solely by men of colour. But as feminists continue to reiterate, rape culture isn't the simplistic notion that sexual assault is somehow being taught as part of the HSC. It's far more subtle than that, and refers more to a state of existence in which the impact and reality of sexual violence is minimised while the perpetrators of it are supported by a complex system built on flawed human beliefs, mythologies about gender, privilege, and good old-fashioned misogyny. The offering of boys will be boys in response to coercive sexual assault is a good example of this, not to mention the frequency with which the female victims of such behaviour are dismissed as sluts, who should have known what they were getting into, with men who are described as good blokes who let things get out of hand. Rape culture isn't about the impulse to excuse or deny perpetrator actions, isn't just about the impulse to excuse or deny perpetrator actions. It also manifests in the way people, many of them in positions of power in their own communities, will bend over backwards to defend those whose predatory and violent actions they also recognise. We have a never-ending list of examples of how rape culture is encouraged, facilitated, and made invisible by white men and the white women who support their supremacy. In 2017, a judge in Utah was described as being on the verge of tears as he sentenced a man found guilty of sexually assaulting 2 women. Judge Thomas Lowe described Keith Vallejo, a former bishop of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as being, quote, "an extraordinarily good man," end quote. Vallejo had been convicted of 2 separate assaults dating back to 2013 because apparently, as the judge said, quote, "great men sometimes do bad things," end quote. This is rape culture. It's the casual ease by which even those people employed to enforce the law are able to assess rape and sexual assault as being somehow separate to a person's character. They are a great bloke, a good friend, an upstanding teammate, an extraordinarily good person. And raping someone is just a separate mistake they made that shouldn't be held against them. Rape isn't something that otherwise good and decent people stumble into. Someone who makes the choice to rape or sexually assault someone who isn't acting out of character. Rather, they are expressing a heinous, repulsive, and central part of their character that all too many people seem willing to overlook in their desire to have these people continue to be good. When people say of a known rapist that they are a good person, what they mean is, they have been good to me. The case has echoes from that of Australian oncologist John Kearsley. In 2013, Kearsley drugged a female colleague whom he had invited to his house for dinner. She woke up to him sexually assaulting her. Kearsley pleaded guilty to charges relating to the assault and was sentenced in August 2016. But in early 2017, the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal agreed to reduce Kearsley's sentence after Kearsley's, quote, extraordinary service to the medical profession, end quote, was successfully argued. Yes, defendants and their lawyers are entitled in our legal system to mount a defence that includes character testimonies. but I contend that a law predominantly written and enforced by men and men of certain privileged backgrounds is fundamentally flawed in its ability to deal with the impact of sex crimes that are mostly perpetrated by men against women. It shouldn't matter that someone has an exemplary record of community service or workplace success, because their ability to treat other people with respect in public doesn't and shouldn't negate their willingness and capacity to assault a single person in private. What service might Kearsley's victim have rendered to the medical profession had she not had her career interrupted by her workplace superior drugging and sexually assaulting her? When people think about the future careers of accused and even convicted rapists, why do they never think about the derailed careers of their victims? What about the case of the rapist Luke Lazarus, whose 2015 conviction for raping a young woman outside his family's nightclub was overturned on appeal on a technicality with a retrial ordered? In his original defense, Lazarus's lawyer argued that Lazarus was, quote, not really the sort of person who would force himself upon someone even when he was sexually excited, end quote. And the argument for this was because he was popular and, quote, got on well with young women, end quote. Also in that trial, a number of prominent, wealthy community members, including the mayor of Waverley, offered character testimonies in favour of Lazarus. In a retrial, his conviction was overturned because the judge believed, among other things, that it couldn't be certain Lazarus hadn't known Saxon Mullins, the incredibly brave woman who came forward later to tell her story to Four Corners, that it couldn't be known that Lazarus knew she wasn't consenting. This is also rape culture, the belief that sexual predation is the domain of loners and social misfits, and that an outward appearance of goodness is a talisman against abusive behaviour. It is possible for many predators to appear as upstanding members of their community, good blokes and charitable women, kind-hearted, salt-of-the-earth types who know how to have a laugh and get on well with everyone. Not all people who commit sexual assault are charming, but charm has always gone a long way to allowing sexually abusive people to hide in plain sight of communities that will overwhelmingly testify in their favour. It is possible, even probable, that a rapist has family and friends who swear by his good character. It is possible, even probable, that a rapist is capable of being nice and funny. We also know the indignities, violence and suffering wrought by rape culture are significantly higher and more pronounced for Indigenous women in this country. In 2011, Paul Morris and Adrian Atwater brutally raped and murdered Lynette Daly on a beach. Lynette was an Aboriginal woman and she suffered dehumanisation even after death. The New South Wales Director of Public Prosecutions twice refused to pursue charges against Atwater and Morris. It took 6 years for the pair to finally be convicted of a combination of aggravated sexual assault, manslaughter, and covering up evidence. In one of his first police interviews, Atwater was reported to have said, "Boys will be boys." It is part of rape culture also that women with disabilities, and intellectual disabilities in particular, continue to be forcibly sterilised without their consent. Not only is it a gross violation of their bodies, but the common excuse offered by the legal system, that it is to prevent sexual assault, is hideously wrong. It doesn't prevent sexual assault. Indeed, sexual assaulters have targeted 90% of women with intellectual disabilities in this country. What it prevents is pregnancy, which is not only a form of eugenics, but also a form of evidence destruction. A large amount of my work over the last few years has involved educating people about rape culture. We have schoolboys sexually assaulting their female peers and sending video footage of it to friends who laugh about it. And these schoolboys are then defended by the adults in their communities as good boys who made a mistake, if it's even admitted they did anything wrong at all, while their victims are shamed and cast out as troublemakers. Girls who should have known better. Rape culture might not be about instructing anyone on how to rape someone, but it certainly is about reassuring through example that those who do won't necessarily be held to account for it. especially if there's a way their victim can be blamed instead. And so back to my son. For too long, girls and women have been the ones expected to protect ourselves against the inevitable impact of rape culture. It's framed not as a culture in which perpetrators are inculcated and massaged into action, but an event controlled by outside forces. Rape is a hurricane or a thunderstorm, and women must be more careful about leaving the house without their wet weather gear. But as I said earlier, goodness is not a static state of being, but a target towards which we must always be striving. It is a challenge that all humans must take on. It has certainly become a constant in my life, unpacking the privilege bestowed on my white middle-class son so that he doesn't weaponize that privilege against anyone else. It's imperative that we recognize and accept that the boys and men we love, especially the ones we raise, are just as likely as anyone else to become a perpetrator of rape and sexual assault. That they are even more likely, without intervention, to become the kinds of people who send rape threats or laugh at rape or dismiss survivor testimonies as mere lies or regret. You don't have to be a rapist to still be an agent of rape culture, but it is up to all of us to determine to be agents of change. Thank you.
Thank you, Clementine.
Thank you, Claire.
Without
No,
an
I.
I. I'm now going to invite Teela Reid to take to the lectern.
Mangdang Guru, thank you. Nurembang Meringue, Yin Yalgi, Yama Yuandi Tila, Nadu, Winang Nangei, Yinjamar, Maringay, May. Durinya, Wurundjeri, Kulanbu, Nurembangabu. Good evening, everyone. I'm Teela. I remember and respect the first people to be born Wurundjeri to the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation as the first peoples of this country. I acknowledge this country, the lands and its waters of the Wurundjeri has never been ceded. Unless you belong to this country, you are a visitor to this country. I would like to acknowledge the advocacy of the many Aboriginal women living on this country. They organise, indeed, some of the largest protests on this vast continent. They show up, they do the hard work, and they are fearless in their resistance and resilience. Aboriginal feminists on this country are not afraid to tell so-called Australia genuinely what needs to be decolonised. And in the words of proud Gooditch, Bindle and Yuramar Islander Tarneen, they are quite ready to burn it down. So what is feminism? And who is a feminist? Most importantly, what is next for the feminist movement? Now, I certainly did not grow up with the term feminism in my vocabulary, nor did I really ever refer to myself as a feminist. It's not that I dispute being called a feminist. I was born and raised on my country in central western New South Wales. And from memory, I do not recall anyone in the small community of 2,500, black or white, say they were feminist. Perhaps feminism generally still has some way to go in educating our young ones on the importance of the movement and why we all must continue to develop all facets of it, and to ensure that even the most marginalised voices are heard. So in saying that, I hope there are many of my titters, yorgas, kudgeries, sister girls, cis, sibs, and non-binary blackfellas out there tonight who are listening with the courage to forge their own path through the feminist movement. Now, I'm certainly not here intending to speak on behalf of every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander woman. I stand here in solidarity with them, each of whom have their own voice and are resisting the colonial empire by reviving their links to their own country. As for me, my very strong matriarchal upbringing in my community meant I knew precisely my place as an Aboriginal woman living in a colonised country. Raised by my single mother, my lessons in feminism not only come from her, they come from my aunties, my grandmother, and my grandfather. I often find myself navigating and negotiating the spaces between race, gender, and class in search for the truth to be told about my people, our land, and our stories. The power and force of the lessons that have been passed down to me to stand here before you as a proud Wiradjuri and Wailwan woman were shared to me through story. I want to be very clear that I'm not here tonight to rant about white feminism. But looking at the panelists, is it a coincidence or is it an act of feminism that I'm wearing white and they're all wearing black? My objective is to explore the concept of Aboriginal feminism. And in order to do this, it is necessary to analyse the operation of race and gender in the colony of Australia. To do so, we must critically examine the invisibility of whiteness that dominates the structures and institutions enforced upon us, if we are truly to liberate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. In her book of essays titled Talking Up to the White Women, Dr. Eileen Morton Robinson, a Gulnpool woman from the Minjerra, Stradbroke Island, wrote, I quote, "Colonial processes have shaped white feminists' oblivion to their race privilege and their indifference to the history of their relations with Indigenous women. The exercising of white race privilege, therefore, remains uninterrogated. The power that whiteness confers is normalised within feminist texts and practice. As beneficiaries of colonisation, white feminists have been able to challenge and remake themselves as white women through the state and other institutions," end quote. One example of white oblivion to privilege was typified in the winter of 2018 when the quarterly essay of Meanjin, an Aboriginal word of the Turrbal language meaning spike of the land, where the city of Brisbane is established, was renamed #MeToo. The cover of the edition literally crossed out the term Meanjin, replacing it in red letters with #MeToo. In response to the whitewashing, Amy Maguire, a Darrinbal and South Sea woman, challenged the erasure of the term Meanjin. She said, I quote, "The destruction of land, cultures and language is fundamentally tied to the violence against Aboriginal women," end quote. The erasure of Aboriginality and the violence against Aboriginal women has been actively denied our cause for seeking truth and justice that existed long before the #MeToo movement. The editor of Meanjin, who was a white male, later apologised for his own quote, blindness, and to their credit, 2 non-Aboriginal contributors, of which one was Clementine Ford, publicly apologised. But the simple fact is, this should not happen at all. We are tired of apologies. We need action. The truth is that Australia has been built and profited off the violence and sexualisation of Aboriginal women who have consistently spoken out well before any fancy hashtag. In 1967, Aboriginal feminist Margaret Valadian was interviewed on Australian TV and described the treatment of Aboriginal women in the colony as black velvet. When asked by the white male interviewer why she thought white men were most unsatisfactory, she replied, I quote, "There is still a hangover. This black velvet that was so much part of our early history, this feeling that coloured women were there for the taking," end quote. Even in the modern era, Aboriginal women have been referred to as a case of jungle fever. This is not a joke. On the one hand, we are expected to act feminine, but on the other hand, we are made to feel not very feminine at all. This is the toxic and diminishing reality we are forced to live in. The dehumanisation of Aboriginal women and our bodies must stop. In 1975, when asked again by a white male interviewer on ABC what women's liberation means, Margaret replied, I quote, "I wonder what women's liberation is all about. In the United States, for example, in New York, what it meant was that American women in that area could do their own thing without regard to the cost to their children. In Australia, in the early days, it meant attaching yourself to the bar of a hotel or bra burning. So women's liberation really means nothing to us." In the same interview, Margaret was asked, is there any sense at all of the sisterhood between black and white women? She said, I quote, "Sisterhood, of course, is something we think about in our own community, but there is no sense of relationship between the Australian woman and the Aboriginal woman," end quote. Now, recently I had a coffee with a very close white girlfriend. She politely advised me I should tone down my social media because I am polarizing people. What did I say? I thought. And who is it polarizing? Me? You? Prove it. She didn't direct me to a single post or comment, but rather went on to politely tone police me. This sort of civility policing and enforcement by white women who present themselves as allies, or not, is a form of modern racism. Aboriginal women in Australia are constantly treading the boundaries of race, gender, and class, all whilst we are expected to neatly fit the desires of middle-class status quo in order to be considered successful or a good little black. I am often quite literally defined by the mainstream as angry, belligerent, wild, polarizing, complex, difficult, a complainer, and even exotic. I'm regularly referred to as an activist. In fact, I am more commonly referred to as an activist than a feminist. So tell me, is the difference the colour of my skin? I want to raise this question with my fellow panellists. How often are you called an activist, or do you fit the code as a feminist? Like many Aboriginal women, the oppression we experience is not just the systems created by the coloniser, but is very much forcefully policed by white women. telling us what to say, how to say it, when we should say it, without offending white fragility. It is like Aboriginal women can't even speak without our words being filtered or probed. When we do speak or attempt to participate in the colony, our liberty is under threat. The alarming fact is that Aboriginal women in Australia are disproportionately incarcerated at the highest rates on record. Oppression and violence is very real to us. How can we be less than 3% of the population, but the most rapidly incarcerated cohort in the country? And why do Aboriginal women continue to die in custody at the hands of police without any accountability for these deaths? For those of you here tonight, what are you doing in the name of feminism to free Aboriginal women from prison and police violence? The reality is the struggle is intensifying for us. Aboriginal women are constantly called upon to justify our very existence. Just this weekend, tennis champion and now world ranked number 3, Ash Barty, won the French Open. The commentary on her achievement in the sport context soon escalated into an examination about her Aboriginal identity. One non-Aboriginal sports commentator spiraled into a draconian analysis of her blood quantum. He said, I quote, "Barty is part Indigenous. Like Adam Goodes, she has a parent from each culture, one Indigenous, one Anglo. That'll do us, all of us, hopefully," end quote. Social media went into meltdown and the definition of Aboriginality came into question. Two prominent Wiradjuri women, Yvonne Goolagong-Cawley and Linda Burney MP, hit back in defence of Ash Barty, who learned as a teenager of her connection to the Naragu people from southern New South Wales and northeastern Victoria. Burney wrote in an op-ed, I quote, "Barty has stated the importance of her Indigenous heritage to her identity, and she is proudly Australian. Among what I can only imagine to be a grueling training schedule, she and her sisters have taken time to learn more about her clan and culture." Burney added, "Achievements on the sporting field remain a major part of First Nations identity in modern Australia," end quote. Now, I'm not here to get into the politics of Aboriginal identity. That's a matter for the respective Aboriginal communities and country. But my point here is the sisterhood of Aboriginal feminism is a force of nature. In my view, the sisterhood of Aboriginal feminism is really about truth-seeking. It is not merely an attack on mainstream feminism. It is a force that is ready to reckon with the status quo. Aboriginal feminism is seeking liberation through speaking our truth. In my language, Wiradjuri language, we say Gariyala. That means speak truth. Now, truth-telling is not a feel-good exercise. It is difficult. It makes people feel uncomfortable. It makes individuals question their own sense of self and reassess their own moral codes. To be part of the sisterhood doesn't necessarily mean we all agree on every issue. It requires forensic analysis and debate on the dilemmas that confront us as Aboriginal women. Aboriginal feminism is not necessarily defined by climbing the corporate or political ladder to the top, nor is it diversifying boardrooms, leaning in, nor is it about the size of our paychecks or breaking through glass ceilings. Aboriginal feminism makes Australia turn a mirror on itself. that reflection doesn't just depict what's at the top end of town. That reflection reveals not only the past 250 years, but it illuminates the truth of 60,000-year history. Most of all, a mirror doesn't lie. It simply reflects what's there. A mirror is incapable of covering up blemishes. It forces you to see them and to confront them. You can either turn away and relinquish to the status quo, or you can step up and dismantle and decolonize the structures that oppress us, that imprison us and dehumanize us. Aboriginal feminists are free thinkers, not confined by theories or elite agendas, but are open to be proven wrong, to somehow find the truth. I want to be clear that Aboriginal feminism runs deeper than the intersection of race and gender. It is intricately interwoven in the sisterhood, where the common thread amongst us is the sacred link to our country, spirit, and ancestors. Aboriginal feminism seeks truth and justice for ourselves, for our children, and for our brothers. Aboriginal feminism does not diminish the role of Aboriginal men through our own liberation. We are one part of the same struggle. We defend our brothers and our sisters, and when we burn it down, we will rebuild our nations alongside one another. For the Aboriginal feminist movement in Australia to truly prosper, white women and white men will need to relinquish power and learn to coexist. The Australian state's toxic sense of superiority over us will be challenged. Why? Because the essence of our movement is informed by our right to self-determination, our connection to our country, and the resilience of the sisterhood. So, to all feminists here tonight, if your feminism is not actively dismantling the structures that oppress Aboriginal women, your feminism is colonial. You have a choice. Either stand with us or step aside. To the sisterhood, whether you are young or old, now is the time to step up. Your voice matters. You are not here to fit the mold. You are here to be bold. Our ancestors did not struggle for us to give up the fight now. Why? Because the truth is, this country has never been ceded. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tila. I'm now going to invite Petra Blueskins to take to the stage, please.
Thank you, Claire.
Okay, when I was first asked to do this talk, which was at the time framed as a debate on the topics of maternal feminism and identity politics, I mentioned it to several friends. The instant response was, "Oh my God, don't do it. It won't be good for you. You'll be attacked. You know your views aren't fashionable anymore." Another friend said, "Oh, that's terrible, Petra. Do you really want to do it? I don't think you should." So where I thought it was, sure, a bit daunting, like Clementine said, but ultimately a great opportunity, I mean, how many feminist gigs are there in town? My peers seemed to think otherwise. Even my therapy supervisor recommended against it. "You'll be hated. Are you ready for this? What does this say about your internal dynamics?" My friend Miri offered to do a role play, jam-packed with worst-case scenarios. I've never liked it when people play cameos of themselves, and I wasn't going to start now. I didn't take up Mary's offer, but I understood it as an altruistic gesture to help me cope with what she and the others imagined was the reputation annihilation coming my way. Then I told my young adult daughter, and she said, "OMG, Mum, you can't have a fight with Clementine Ford in public. That is so embarrassing. We love her. What the hell, Mum?" Ever the researcher, it dawned on me that this disparate set of responses, indeed the polarisation of the 20-somethings and the 40-somethings or the 40-plus-somethings, was actually a rich, if anecdotal, data set. The polarisation speaks to something at the heart of contemporary debates around identity politics, motherhood, generation, gender, age, feminism, and the culture wars. My milieu are middle-aged women, mostly professional mothers, with a smattering of stay-at-homes on the left, or what we might more properly call the old left, in both senses of the word. We're getting older, and we're focused more on redistribution and structural power imbalances than on identity and its seemingly never-ending proliferation. Many of us don't relate to identity politics as it's playing out today and find the kinds of vitriol and abuse we see on social media between, in broad terms, the alt-right and the Tumblr left, anathema to our sense of politics and discourse. While for my adult daughter's generation, and I might add I have her consent to share her response, the dynamism of online feminism and its invigoration over the past 10 years has been really inspiring. We have a new and passionate third-wave feminist voice that took up where the university women's studies courses left off. A major media feminist with a devastating critique of the patriarchy and a huge social media following has emerged in most Western countries. To name a few, Jessica Valenti in the US, Laurie Penny in the UK, and our own Clementine Ford. I love the way this online feminism has re-energised debates. As I listened to Fight Like a Girl in preparation for this talk, I found myself saying yes out loud all the time. Having said that, I listened to it on audiobook, usually while cleaning and doing laundry. I have 2 young children and 3 jobs, so what I love about audiobooks is how they facilitate ever greater forms of multitasking. So you need to imagine me with headphones in my ears, wiping the bench, washing dishes, and trudging around with a laundry basket saying, "Down with the patriarchy," while a little person is yelling, "Mum, can you get me a drink? Mum, where are my socks?" Not exactly the image of liberation, but an accurate description nonetheless. But I have to say, while I find myself cheering, I am also concerned about the lack of nuance in new online identity politics. I'm not talking about Clem's work in particular here, but more broadly. My sense is that the changing, arguably declining norms of discourse, characteristic of social media, and a near-obsessive focus on increasingly niche areas of sexuality and gender identity, alongside a politics of unremitting grievance, is alienating many people and in many respects making feminism less relevant to the lives of, dare I say it, ordinary women. In my view, this is exactly what is producing the so-called silent majority phenomenon. Not that I'm suggesting my woke friends voted for ScoMo, only that when we push differences of opinion underground, when we literally pathologise opinions by calling them hate speech, we don't make them go away. They either move underground or into their own social media silos. When, for example, discussing mothers is called essentialist, or when a gender-critical perspective is called transphobic, and here I take real umbrage because a phobia is a mental disorder, not a difference of opinion. Or when the answer to viewpoint diversity is to block, delete, ban, abuse and no platform, we exacerbate the problem of intellectual and cultural silos, closing ourselves off into our own curated Facebook feeds and hermetically sealed echo chambers. The end result being we speak only to the converted and less across political and socio-economic differences. The sense of a shared centre as the basis of civil society and arguably of civility itself seems also to be fraying at the edges. What I'd like to stress here is that there is not only a silent majority, the disparagingly labelled normies, there is also a silent minority, a disgruntled left that dare not speak its name. I think this position was encapsulated in Michael Loonig's recent cartoon, Warning. In it, Mr. Curley looks up at a foreboding Moses-like tablet, and I think the religious reference is apt, that announces, quote, "This is an inclusive society, and if we think you are talking, thinking, or behaving in a non-inclusive way, you will be excluded." Mr. Curley looks bemused and confused. Here's the problem with the New Left Puritanism and paradoxically conservative ethos, is that it's closing down discussion rather than opening it. It hasn't made a diversity of views disappear. It has pushed them underground, where they have festered, radicalised, and moved to the ever-growing online right. It is now de rigueur to come out as a lefty who has turned right. From the YouTube star Dave Rubin, to the comedians behind Trigonometry, to the Canadian academic and feminist, former feminist, Janice Fiamenjo, to the burgeoning intellectual dark web, with Jordan Peterson and his 2 million followers at the masthead. And there's all sorts of lesser known but no less fascinating figures on YouTube, like the Prim Reaper, who challenges feminist orthodoxies in every video. Mostly I disagree with her, but she's articulate and impassioned. There's even a short 4-minute video explainer called Why I Left the Left, for anyone contemplating such a move and needing assistance. It's mostly men undergoing alt-right conversion at this stage, but to simply mock it, to dismiss it as the preserve of the deplorables, would be a mistake. It is a social movement with leaders, publications, a logic and ideology, and a large, geographically disparate base. It has emerged in specific and targeted opposition to the identity politics of the left. Now let me segue into identity politics in a way that may surprise you, given the points I've just been making. Feminism inherited a problem by virtue of its existence. I'm going to say that again because it's a very important point. Feminism inherited a problem by virtue of its existence. It is a problem that dates back to the early modern feminists, which was a term that had not yet been invented, but I'll call them feminists to keep matters simple. The problem is what the political philosopher Carol Pateman calls Wollstonecraft's dilemma, after the great dame herself. The dilemma is this: feminism calls for equality with men, and it does so under the sign of difference. It says, we women over here, marked by our exclusion from the social contract, want to be equal. In other words, we call forth difference, we collectivise and politicise that difference and give it a name, feminism, in order to argue for its precise opposite, equality. This, in a nutshell, is Wollstonecraft's dilemma. The famous historian Nancy Cott wrote about this dilemma in the formation of modern feminism in the early 20th century, when the term first entered general usage in the US and defined the movement we still recognise today. For Cott, the early 20th century feminists wanted equality with men, but also recognition of what made them different. They promoted gender consciousness, that is feminism, while hoping at the same time to abolish gender roles. Here again, just over 100 years later, we see Wollstonecraft's dilemma. It is still with us. Arguably, we cannot resolve Wollstonecraft's dilemma, although I've got some ideas that I'm exploring about this in 2 forthcoming papers. Rather, it is a fertile coming together of opposites that philosophically and politically animates feminism. What does all this have to do with identity politics? Well, a lot, as it turns out. Since the identity woman, like the identity black or homosexual, has to be created, politically speaking, in order to defend itself against its constitutive exclusion. I don't particularly like Foucault or Butler, but this is what they are saying when they talk about the social construction of homosexuality or of gender. We are created as the second sex, or the other, and on this basis seek to reverse the devaluation, again from the devalued place, which we also attempt to revalue, hence the focus on difference. Feminism grew out of precisely the contradiction between a society based on freedom and equality for all, the great promise of the European Enlightenment, and the denial of these same rights to women, among others. This was the fertile ground of the, quote, woman right movement, as it was then known, in the singular. The point is, the identity in identity politics was, in the first instance, assigned to women, not chosen by us, even if it was taken up by feminists, turned on its head and politicised. And this is where our neocon, new right, alt-right and dark web critics get it wrong. Feminists and any other minority or oppressed group didn't choose the sign of their exclusion, and they didn't choose the meaning attached to their difference, real or imagined. And it is for this reason feminists, even those like myself, or the writer Angela Nagel, who's written the wonderful book Kill All Normies, that I can't recommend enough, who cringe and grimace at the excesses of identity politics, cannot simply get rid of it. Feminism is a politics of identity, the identity of woman, and more recently, its pluralisation, the many and varied women for whom it speaks. You might say feminists have always spoken truth to power, and I agree. From Wollstonecraft to the suffragists, from Simone de Beauvoir and Betty Friedan to Kate Millett and Shulamith Firestone, who bequeathed us with the colourful expression that I've always wanted to say in public, that having a baby was like shitting a pumpkin. To our own glorious Germaine Greer, there have been widely disparate opinions and an ability to speak truth to power. However, this discourse followed rules that seem all but gone in online culture wars of today. When an icon of second-wave feminism like Germaine Greer is no platform because she doesn't hold the correct opinion, we know that free thought and free speech is rapidly going down the drain. We used to have a variety of feminisms. I was taught the academic taxonomy in my first year women's studies class. We learnt that there were liberal feminists and socialist feminists and radical feminists and eco-feminists and black feminists who called themselves womanists, and later a curious category who didn't believe in categories, the postmodern feminist. There were fruitful discussions and provocative ideas, debates and arguments across these schools of thought. But now that internal diversity is gone. Partly, that's about the destruction of women's studies in the university. So we don't have the different schools of feminist thought actually represented and taught. And partly that's about a new ideological uniformity and conformity. Women's studies became gender studies, and gender studies and gender was deconstructed out of existence. That's a dilemma. In the current confluence of ideas, then, we see the postmodernist and the modernist tropes coming together. The legitimate, but in my view, partial feminist desire to liberate women from the confines of domesticity, remembering, of course, that there were many less privileged women whose motherhood was not protected, namely in this country, Indigenous mothers. This liberal feminism of liberation from the domestic dovetailed with the postmodern critique deconstructing women. The two together, I contend, have blown the focus on motherhood out of the water. So from the high point in the late 70s and early 80s, where feminist scholars integrated the insights of the second wave with a prodigious flowering of writing on motherhood, including Adrienne Rich's Of Woman Born, Nancy Chodoro's The Reproduction of Mothering, Nancy Friday's My Mother, Myself, Jane Lazar's The Mother Knot, and Sarah Ruddock's Maternal Thinking, we moved to a curious silence. What happened to the burgeoning of academic feminist work on motherhood? What happened is Judith Butler happened. And after that, it became problematic to talk about women. And so we spent all our time deconstructing women and exposing women's sins. We could talk about feminists as bigots. We could attack ourselves and others for false universalising or essentialism. This was a period defined by what Professor Carol Pateman calls essentialist hunting. What we couldn't do was develop a feminist theory of motherhood. In the flagship feminist journal Signs, Professor Samita Kawash elegantly summed up the situation thus, and I quote, "By the late 1990s, difference feminism had been eclipsed and was no longer a serious topic of discussion in feminist graduate programs or in the academic feminist press. The deconstruction of woman and the post-structuralist accounts of gender and power left motherhood to the side, an embarrassing theoretical relic of an earlier naive view of the essential woman and her shadow, the essential mother." And I think that's what gets us into trouble when we talk about motherhood. Firstly, there are the current culture wars informed by 2 decades of postmodernism around claiming our reproductive biology as distinctively female. That's the essentialist bit, or worst, but we won't go there. And secondly, there is the older, classically liberal feminist agenda to grant rights to women as abstract individuals, to extend their equality, which has for the most part meant transcending the traditional roles in the home of wife and mother. In many respects, feminism has always been more comfortable with separating mothers and children and separating out women from the domestic roles than with developing a politics of care and connection, a feminist politics of motherhood. I understand this. As a matricentric feminist, a term coined by my colleague and friend, Professor Andrea O'Reilly, this is clear. It was necessary to prize apart the categories of woman and mother, which for most of human history, in most cultures, were one and the same. Women in the West fought hard to gain their freedom as individuals, with legally recognised and socially sanctioned property in the person, an awkwardly legalistic phrase that is at the bedrock of the rights of every woman in this room. This prying apart of the category of woman from the categories of wife and mother was an integral dimension of the feminist project. It was arguably the most fundamental because it meant many things simultaneously: gaining control over our bodies and their sexual use, gaining control over our fertility, whether to have or not to have a baby, gaining control over our properties, estates and income, should we have any, and ultimately gaining control over our minds, preferences and desires, with the ultimate view of contributing to the social order. We take this for granted today, but the recognition of women as sovereign individuals was a massive historical achievement, and one we should thank our foremothers for. It is very recent and it is very fragile, which is, I think, what makes watching The Handmaid's Tale so terrifying. We understand, even if only unconsciously, how contingent and how fragile our rights are. Look at Alabama, where egregious laws undermining women's abortion rights and thus bodily autonomy have been enacted into law in the last month. Truly appalling. It is my firm belief that until we can say no to motherhood, and this applies equally to marriage and indeed any sexual union, we cannot say yes to it. We had to insist on civil autonomy before we could properly choose motherhood. But this feminist emphasis leaves us with a remainder. How do we articulate a feminist politics of motherhood? If motherhood, and specifically I mean motherhood under patriarchy, has been something women have rightly fought hard against, and the fight is not over, what comes after? This is difficult indeed when we look at the structural constraints and inequities of motherhood, because, as I argue in my book, motherhood is a critical turning point in the loss of equality for women. Whether we look at career trajectory, income, leisure, even sleep, it all declines after motherhood. And for most women, it never regains its former upward trajectory. At best, it plateaus. More typically, it declines. We see this is especially pronounced with the pay gap, and we know that unpaid family work is why women have much lower superannuation balances on average than men, and why older divorced women who have done the right thing and taken care of husbands and children are especially at risk of poverty and are the fastest growing group to be homeless in Australia. Indeed, I make the argument that women are granted a normative freedom as individuals, but this has a shelf life marked by first-time motherhood. I provide a lot more detail on the pay gap and the leisure gap and the domestic division of labour in my book and articles on this topic. Suffice it to say, my argument is that while women are free as individuals in modern Western societies, they are constrained as mothers, and that these two phenomena are in fact related. It is motherhood that marks the turning point and leaves women vulnerable to poverty if they are not married or partnered, which I argue casts a long shadow over consent. Again, we are not free to be in something if we are not free to leave it. I call this arrangement the new sexual contract. It used to be that women passed from father to husband to honour and obey, and there were no other socially permissible roles, spinster aunts and widows notwithstanding. Now we have legal equality and civil rights, but we also have pronounced inequality that routinely for women takes root after motherhood, which in part explains declining fertility across the West. Although it is beyond the scope of today's paper, I think we need a basic income, or a small but livable income paid to every mother who bears a child in recognition of the valuable work she performs, and in order to equalise the power imbalances that routinely emerge for women in their relationships and in their workplaces. At the level of feminist theory and practice, I think we need a maternal or matricentric feminism that recognises the value of this care, that fights for women's rights to be with their children. Liberation is not only via the neoliberal path of paid work, and rarely are mothers able to meet ideal worker norms anyway. This is one path that should be supported, but liberation from dependence on marriage into long hours work culture, premised upon 20th century notions, or norms rather, of the male breadwinner who had a wife at home, indoors, who took care of all the unpaid work, is not what will work to liberate most women. Transitioning into full-time, long hours paid work is not necessarily the answer for all women. We need to connect a feminist politics of autonomy with an ethic of care. In The Whole Woman, published 20 years ago this year, Germaine Greer asserted that we need to make, quote, dignified motherhood a feminist priority, and she was right. We need to connect equality with difference, or autonomy with care. This is how we resolve Wollstonecraft's dilemma.
Thank you so much, Petra.
Thank you, Claire.
Well, I have heard these talks tonight for the first time myself. I didn't have the benefit of reading their speeches beforehand, so I'm listening to them in real time as you are. But I now have the task of processing all that we've heard tonight, which has been, I think you'll agree, a lot. And trying to put it back to our three speakers in a way that then can now broaden the discussion. So I have so many questions that spring from that, but I suppose what I'd like to do is to draw out some of the themes that I think that you've identified that run through the three of your talks, and then maybe that can springboard into teasing out some of the differences there. And the first one that I'd like to address is this issue of invisibility or silencing. That came through very strongly in each of them. Clem, you talked about rape culture being normalised as part of our general culture, and particularly a boys will be boys type culture that many of us are familiar with. Tilly, you've talked about whiteness being normalised, so it's not something that we even see and are awake to in most instances. And then very interestingly, Petra, I think you've talked about the old left or those older structuralist arguments about women's lives and experiences, and particularly the experiences of older women or mothers being silenced in the new hashtag feminism. You quite confidently called it a third wave of feminism. I thought was interesting. Maybe we can touch on that as well. That is more about identity politics. So maybe I'll throw this to you, Clem, first. Picking up this idea of invisibility or silence, how do we raise our voices beyond a room like this? How do we raise our voices? How do we blow the lid off? How do we burn it down so that these structures, these elements, these parts of our culture that are just taken for granted start to be at the forefront of people's consciousness?
Well, actually, in the spirit of having listened to Tila's amazing speech, I would prefer that the first question go to her.
Thanks, Claire.
Sorry. Doesn't necessarily have to be that question. But
Well, no. Look, I actually was quite intrigued by Clementine's presentation because I, for one, am an Aboriginal woman who often tries to speak the truth in many different contexts, but my day job is a defence lawyer. So, like...
defence lawyers hate me.
So this concept of truth that Clem was talking about in this realm of rape culture was really interesting to me. Because when I go about my job, I operate on this very hardcore principle, but there is this the presumption of innocence. And last night actually...
All men are guilty, Tila.
And look, last night I went to this theatre production last night in Sydney, and it was called Prima Facie. And I'm not sure if any of y'all have heard of it, but it really encapsulates literally everything Clementine was saying about sexual assault and as Claire said, truth and invisibility. And one of the quotes, and I'll just raise the quote that was said last night in the production, was, "There is no such thing as real truth, only legal truth." And look, I find it quite frustrating, and often I am left wondering what is truth and what is justice, and I mean, I don't really have an answer, and I don't think all men are guilty. But it was interesting, and I think because I see the world through that kind of, layers, this concept of truth is something that I consistently think about, whether it's as an Aboriginal woman or a woman generally, or as a lawyer defending. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
I think that, I do understand that the legal system that we live in works on the premise of providing everyone with the opportunity to have a defence, and I support that. I guess where my positioning comes from is that, firstly, the legal system, a lot of people seem to, members of the public who respond to stories of rape and trials, and particularly, the increasing privilege of the person accused of that crime, as it increases, people are more and more likely, of course, to defend them. Look at sports players and the public defences that are offered for sports players. And I think one of my frustrations is that people treat the legal system as if it's been handed to us from a higher power, as opposed to having been largely designed by the people who've had the most amount of privilege in society.
So I guess that raises the question, what do we do in this context? Separately, I was also thinking about, when you were talking, the Rush case in New South Wales, where it was a defamation matter in Sydney that was run, where a young woman had made a complaint and Rush brought a defamation action. But a lot of the findings in that was questions about her credibility, which has all these ramifications. And of course, the legal system is created by, generally, the reality is white privileged men, and we have to operate in that system. So what do we do now to dismantle it and change it to ensure that justice is served for victims of sexual assault?
I'd like to make a point there. I think the other point that's relevant is how historically recent, I'm a sociologist, but I'm a bit obsessed with history, your discipline, how historically recent it is that women have had bodily autonomy, that they've had rights. I mean, rape in marriage was only outlawed the year my eldest daughter was born, 1994. That's phenomenal when we think about the fact that women haven't had that bodily autonomy actually enshrined in the law for very long at all. It's hardly surprising that women's testimony, a word that in Latin comes from testicle, the same root word. So again, a man's testimony bore stronger weight than a woman's. We absolutely cannot forget that that's integral to why we don't think women's testimony has validity. The deck is stacked, culturally speaking, absolutely.
So how do we change that situation? So one of the questions, the overarching question of the forum tonight is where to with feminism, what is still left to do? But I think one of the things that came out very strongly from all your presentations is how are we going to do it? Identifying it is one thing, but then, you know, maybe we'll all be accused of being activists, Tila, but how do we do that? Is part of the answer to have more women in the legal system who are going to burn those structures down? Or, I mean, Clem, you've argued in other forums that just having more women in politics isn't going to change politics, that isn't necessarily a win for feminism to have more women elected to Parliament.
It's like celebrating, you know, the number of women in the coalition as a win for feminism while discounting exactly what it is that they're representing is, you know, women can definitely, we know all about official women who love to be the only woman in the room, or who think that if there can only be one woman in the room, then they'll work as hard as they can to make sure it's them rather than changing the room. But also just back on the, you know, the legal system, and I don't know a lot about this topic, but it's something I've become really interested in, and I'm following the work of, you know, people like organisations like Sisters Inside who, you know, are advocating for abolition. And that's been a huge challenge for me actually to think about, because philosophically, I am in complete agreement. I don't think that prison works, and I also think that prison, again, reflects a system of privilege in which the most privileged people in society are kept out of it, and as Tila pointed out, the most disadvantaged people in society are the ones who are being funneled into it. So I think, yes, abolish prisons, and then I'm extremely challenged by, well, what do you do with someone like Luke Lazarus then? I don't have an answer for that, but it's something that I'm trying to explore. And, you know, I know that, you know, there's been suggestions that if you were to try rape cases in the civil court as opposed to the criminal court, then you might result in a higher level of conviction, which just having the conviction might change how a survivor processes that. But I'm not sure. I mean, obviously it's also something that people react to individually, and I don't think it's up to anyone to say to a survivor of a sex crime that the person who perpetrated that crime against them shouldn't. It's a very complicated topic, you know. But I think actually, sorry, just briefly, that is why it's so important to go back to the root of, you know, how do we prevent it happening? And I think that to view sex crimes as being largely perpetrated by people who do move through the world as quote unquote normally as anyone else, as opposed to sort of the idea that they just kind of peel out of the walls and they're not really humans, they're sort of half monsters almost, they're the literal boogie monster. I think that's what we need to kind of start addressing, obviously, and, you know, educating children about consent and respectful relationships, and being really, really insistent on the fact that we won't just let things slide anymore, and we won't just protect the boys that we know and love, and as I said, accept the possibility that unless we become proactive interventionists, there's nothing we can do to stop our son becoming a rapist. We should accept that that's a possibility.
Okay, so let's take that up. Proactive interventionists, I like that line. And another theme that ran through all of the presentations was one that, I'll use your word right at the start, Clem. You used the word goodness, which I think is a really interesting word, not one that we hear in public debate very much. So your argument largely, and you've just put it again then, is that we need to be good mothers to our sons.
Well, good parents.
Yeah. And good parents, good mothers and fathers to our sons. And maybe we can talk about fathering in a minute as well. And Tila, I think you also introduced the concept that if we are going to be good feminists, then we need to show solidarity with Indigenous feminists, and part of the answer there is just to be alive to it, to be aware that everything that we do is impactful in some way, and that if we're not, as you said at the end, if we're not helping, then we're hindering the process. And Petra, I think you were really saying that there is something, there's a goodness, a true value in the idea of women as maternal citizens. Mm-hmm. and that stands in contrast to the neoliberal citizen. Can you explain that a little bit more and unpack this idea of maternal citizenship and how it might relate to this concept of being good feminists and good mothers across the board in terms of creating change and intervention?
That's a big question, but I'll speak to the maternal citizenship question perhaps, because I think it's a really interesting one. Of course, as you would know, maternal feminism emerged at the same time as suffragism, and at times they worked together and at times they were oppositional, where the sort of notion of a Republican motherhood or a woman performing her citizen duties through her domestic role was the way in which she could make the best contribution. I find that unless it socialises the maternal and actually puts it into the political sphere, it's problematic, because what it said was, you women can stay in the private sphere in ways that I think were historically constructed anyway. Medieval women didn't stay at home, they all worked. So this notion of the stay-at-home mother was very much a product of industrialisation, the development of capitalism and the development of liberalism. I mean, the idea of the good mother was actually invented by Rousseau, who wrote The Social Contract. So I think that all goes together. So the idea of the maternal citizen, I think, is the wrong way around. It's the cart before the horse. We had to actually get the freedom first, which is what I was trying to say. And then I think from the place of having civil equality, we then reinvent the social order to reflect our interests. And given that something around 85% of women have kids, one can safely say that having children and mothering is a fairly important thing to the majority of women, but it's still something that leads to major disadvantage. So maternal citizenship, I think, in its late modern cast as opposed to its earlier modern cast, is a maternalism that relies first on having civil equality and second, I think, on emphasising the maternal, and then defining models of citizenship that aren't bound up with, I think, or that separate out from the normative male worker model. I'm not sure if I answered the second part of that question, but I hope I answered the first.
Tila, how would you respond to that?
Look, I'm not generally across that, but speaking as a young millennial Aboriginal girl, when I think about motherhood, having children, to be honest, look, I get questions at me because some people say to me, "You're Aboriginal, how have you not had children yet?" You know, and I just think, what is it any of your business? You know, and
Also, you're racist.
And also you're racist. But at the same time, I just think I haven't even made a decision yet whether I do want to have children, and I think that's okay. That's my choice. And yeah, look, it's not something I generally talk about, but when I do think about, particularly as a millennial, given how expensive it is to live these days, the expectation on us to get mortgages, to get properties, to have careers, to have successful relationships, the last thing I'm thinking about is bringing a child into that equation. So yeah, I don't know, generally speaking, I haven't even made up my mind, and I don't think it's anyone else's business.
I think that, I really wanted to have a child eventually. I had 2 abortions in my 20s because I did not want to have children then. And then when I reached my mid-30s, I felt the urge. Doesn't happen to everyone. I do wonder if the 85% statistic reflects desire or if it just reflects, there's still a lot of women from lots of different backgrounds who do what they think is expected of them. They get married, they have a child, and actually I don't think marriage really makes women very happy. And I think when you introduce a child to that scenario, I think that a woman's unhappiness increases because it's not necessarily the child that's making her unhappy, but the lack of support that she invariably gets and the gender dynamic that she falls into. But I'm also interested as well in thinking about, Tila again mentioned the stereotyping and the sort of racist expectations that racist questioning that she confronted. And something I think a bit about as well is I experience motherhood as a difficult, hard labour, but I have so many systems of support that help me to move through that state in an easier way than someone else. And something interesting, I think, is that you'll see a lot of women who look like me joking about wine time, or they have to drink to get through the night, or it's really easy for us to make those jokes, but I'm cognizant of the fact that if Tila did have children, that people would respond to those jokes very differently. And there's my friend Amy, she's an amazing Aboriginal academic, and she pointed out just yesterday that two very tragic situations, the Aboriginal mother in Queensland whose two boys drowned, and then another young mother in Victoria, whose toddler son drowned in a dam. Now, the Aboriginal mother's been arrested and charged with manslaughter for that, but I'm not saying that either of them should have been, but the same response has not been, directed to the young white mother.
Created equal, is what you're saying.
And so the choice of even becoming a mother is fraught for many women for many different reasons.
Can I make a point to that? We highlight, I guess, especially when women have younger children, how arduous it is and how difficult it is and how tiring it is and all the rest of it, and that it makes women unhappier, and it does. And the research on happiness shows that happiness plummets after the birth of a child, but meaning...
If you're with a man.
No, women too, but meaning increases, and that's not unimportant. Okay, so having children is hard work, but it's meaningful work. And I think that becomes clearer as you get older. And so I think it's important that when we talk about motherhood, we absolutely have to put the dirty washing out. But we need to have a nuanced discussion, because it's not just bad news. It actually makes our lives deeply meaningful to have children, and that's why we have them.
Tila, you mentioned one of the things that came out very strongly for me was about the mothers and the grandmothers in Indigenous communities, that women they have a strong presence, they have a strong voice, and that they were part of you and your sense of becoming a strong, resilient, incendiary woman. You've been a very strong advocate for the First Nations voice to Parliament, and I'm just wondering how you see Indigenous women's voice playing out in that context. Is that a place, would it be easier for Indigenous women to have a voice within their own communities, and therefore via that mechanism into our national parliament, into a national conversation that they don't have already?
Well, look, the movement for a voice to be enshrined in the Constitution is led by Aboriginal women. The fight is being taken up by leaders in our Aboriginal community who happen to be women. How that translates from the ground up to Canberra, for example, will be a matter for the community. It's not a matter for me to say who or whether they're male, female, youth, to have a say in that process. The whole point of the principle to ensure that a voice is heard in Aboriginal communities is a matter for those communities. In terms of Aboriginal women's role in it, they are leading the structural change. These changes that we're talking about, if we're operating in this system run by, that is created essentially by white males, it is what we're seeing now is such a unique time that we're living in right here, where the fight and resistance against that is led by people like Arnie Pat Anderson and Professor Megan Davis, who are literally, they're not worried necessarily about Parliament that they want to get the people on board this movement. And I think that the fearlessness and the resistance of those women in particular, who I look up to, are not afraid to tear it down and change it and dismantle it, despite all the low expectations that get shun upon us. They are ready to do the hard work, and we need everyone to stand with us in that.
So is that one practical way in which white feminists could stand behind and with and in solidarity with their Indigenous sisters, is to get behind the voice to Parliament and
Absolutely.
the Uluru Statement?
Absolutely. Yes.
So that leads me just to the last point I'd like to raise before we open it to questions, which is the third theme that I think came through very strongly, which is this one of sovereignty. And in different ways. Petra, you were talking about a rights agenda, which is essentially about sovereignty, in terms of a legal sovereignty and a political sovereignty. Tila, you in terms of talking about decolonising and self-determination, and Clem, very much the move against rape culture or any resistance to rape culture has to be about bodily autonomy. So again, there seems to be a theme that unites, and yet there are divisions within it as well. Petra, maybe can you speak to that? I know I haven't really given you a question there.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to speak to. That's okay. I'm sure I can ad-lib. Okay, so...
No, okay,
I'll give you...
Do you want me to give you a direct question?
I'm all right, I think.
All right, go.
I'll see how I go. I think you're saying that the three of us are talking about sovereignty in different and intersecting ways, and I think that that's absolutely true. I think that they're different positions because they arise out of different histories. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tila, but it strikes me that you're talking about matters to do with colonisation, perhaps that they trump matters of gender, because that's more fundamental at some level. Would that be right?
I think what I was trying to express was that the sovereignty of the country has never been ceded generally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, it strikes me that we're talking at different levels there around what sovereignty is. One is about nation state and culture, and the other's about body. And I think mine, in some ways, has parallels with Clementine's position around sovereignty of the body. But they're different sovereignties. I mean, one of my favourite political theorists, Carol Pateman, has written a book, The Sexual Contract, that I have used a lot, but she's also co-written a book with an Afro-Caribbean scholar who's written a book called The Racial Contract. And then they've written one about how the two connect, and it's a really, really heavy book. But they're not the same, actually. They're not the same set of issues, colonisation and the exclusion of women from the suffrage, and then the consequences of that, and then our inclusion and what that means when we're included. So I think that they're actually really quite specific and different issues, even though there's a historical, a long-standing historical, I guess, relationship between, you know, the abolition of slavery, the removal of colonisation and women's suffrage. They're not the same issues, and I don't think you can easily talk about them in the same way. I think they're really quite different issues. I don't know if that's answered where you're going with that.
Do either of you want to comment on this issue of self-determination? Tila, does self-determination mean different thing for Indigenous women than it does from Indigenous men?
I don't want to speak on behalf of anyone, but no, I think it means the same thing. It's set out in law. If everyone reads the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 3 sets out the right to self-determination, and it's a principle. Really, when I think of sovereignty, it's a legal and political concept. So it's not easy to define at all. And I would be setting myself up to fail if I was to try and express exactly what it is. But the starting point from a First Nations perspective is to simply assert that sovereignty in Australia has never been ceded. And that was what the Uluru Statement drew a line. It reasserted that. It never was ceded, it never will be ceded, and that in order then to build a better nation, we invite the Australian people to walk with us. We understand this dilemma. that we are now living in, every Australian really understands that the statistics are not getting better for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And the two substantive issues that were raised in the Uluru Statement, for example, were the removal of Aboriginal children, the protection of Aboriginal children, and youth detention. So it was couched in that context, but it was really about structural reform. If we are, as a peoples, asserting our sovereignty has never been ceded, and we understand we all need to coexist, then walk with us. Firstly, it's an invitation. Let's get a referendum across the line. Let's lead the Australian people to successfully enshrine a First Nations voice to Parliament. And let's begin the process of treaty making. This is something, that's happening absolutely here in Victoria at the state level, and I totally respect all the hard work that is being done here. But in Australia, we live in a complex system that is unlike any other nation. You can't look to New Zealand as a comparator for us because we live in a complex layer of local, state, federal governments. New Zealand has an unwritten constitution. For example, one of their founding documents is the Treaty of Waitangi. It's very different. We have a very unique dilemma in Australia where really the solution that First Nations people have said and asserted is walk with us to get the Uluru Statement and enshrine those reforms. So, Scott Morrison, bring on that referendum.
Okay, you came for a discussion about politics and you got it. So we'll have questions from the audience now. There are roving mics. You can, if you put your hand up and thrust it really hard in the air, these wonderful Trobe people in their red T-shirts. And can you pop it to this person here?
My question is for Petra, but I'm going to open it up to everybody else in the panel. This idea of identifying the other, and when we're introducing someone or identifying a particular group within society, we often identify them by how they're different. So is it counterproductive to be identifying a particular group but then actually wanting us all to be equal?
Was the question for me or?
Whoever. Well, you mentioned that in your speech.
Yeah,
Anyway.
you take it, and I think Clem's got something to say
okay,
too.
sure. I think it's up to individuals how they want to be identified. So I'm not sure, in the sense that equality is something that we have enshrined in the law, and then people can decide their identities as they choose. I think that's the only way I can answer that question. What I think is interesting about the shift to identity is that we've moved to this I identify as, and I think that's a really interesting, less kind of solid way of saying who one is. We used to say, I am a woman, or I am a Catholic, or I am a Collingwood supporter, or whatever. I'm just adding lib here. Now we say, I identify as, and I think it indicates a kind of tenuousness in the link, and that there's been a shift in identity that's less solid as our social order is less solid. Declining religion, communities that are more fluid and transient. For lots of different reasons, we live in social and societies that are more transient than they ever used to be. And so I think identity, the identity and identity politics is more fragile now. It's part of what the call for recognition is all about. You don't need that much recognition when your identity is pretty solid and you've got absolutely no choice about what your identity is. It's fixed. So I think that there's a new kind of tenuousness and provisionality in identity. I identify as, not I am.
I think that what is quote unquote normalised versus what is other is the key. So cis men are normalised as the normal and everything else is the other. Whiteness is normalised as the standard and everything else is the other. And so I see what you're saying about is it counterproductive to assign labels to create identity in the minds of people who we're talking to. But at the same time, I also disagree really with the premise that that a progressive society is seeking equality. I think that seeking equality within a structurally unsound system is wrong. To seek equality within a society that is founded on principles of white supremacy, male supremacy, even class supremacy, is to try and create some sort of substandard. It's to try and navigate that system with minimal harm, when actually what we should be doing is dismantling the system and creating a new, like striving for liberation via resistance and dismantling. And I think to liberate people from an oppressive society is not just to say, well, women deserve equality with men, because actually patriarchy oppresses men too, in different ways to the ways that it oppresses women, and it provides certain benefits too, but it is still inherently an oppressive system. So to me, seeking equality within that system is a flawed premise. I had a little bit of, I did disagree with some of the things that Petra said in her speech, but I'm not going to fight with you.
My daughter wouldn't have it.
I think that I bristle a little bit when people criticise identity politics from this position of identity politics being not just bad, but also kind of like the realm of whinging millennials or people who want to like centre themselves as individuals. Because the reason that identity politics exists is, of course, because people who've existed in marginalised identities have never been respected as having voices or being part of the world that we live in. And I think that for people to assert their identities and to assert their the way that they belong to collectives and they belong to marginalised groups is something that I think the dominant groups need to listen to. I mean, I would think that it's probably fairly obvious that most of the reformed left who go on to become angry YouTubers who complain about identity politics are probably all white. You know?
No, actually, there's a mix.
Well, I would say that I would bet money that most of them were white. I could be wrong, but I think that it's the reaction that people have to, particularly people on the left. It's like when I've had arguments in the past with men who consider themselves really good men, who say things like, well, if you continue with that attitude, then you're just alienating your allies. And I think, well, you're not really an ally if you are fundamentally unable to sit there and feel uncomfortable about what it is that I'm saying. I felt really uncomfortable in a lot of parts of what you were saying because it felt true to me. And it's important, when I sort of say that that goodness is not a static state of being, it's something we have to work towards constantly, forever. It's because we don't just get to decide, oh, I'm a good person because I think I'm not racist. I'm a white person living in Australia. I definitely engage in racist practices. I might not do it consciously, but it's important for me to recognise that I do and to sit there in the discomfort that comes from that.
That's Tila's mirror, isn't it?
Can I give just another take on the whole situation? Like, literally, you can travel anywhere in this country and you meet a black fella and they're like, who's your mob? Where you from? Literally, like, we are always saying that. And that gives people power and strength when they're able to say their mob, their country, their connection. And that's something that I think everyone should be really proud of First Nations reasserting that strength and who we are as nations in those collectives. Like, it made me think about when the last election rolled in and I was watching it live and my friend had a party and it didn't really turn out to be a party. But as the country literally, the map of Australia turned slowly a shade of blue and in some parts red, representing each party. And I just thought, this is just status quo for us blackfellas. This is just business as usual. And one day, I do hope that the map of Australia turns multicolour so that the voices of those many nations are represented, whether it's male, female, children, whatever, are representing their nations. And I think that's something that we should be absolutely embracing, is this difference. And this, I think we really need to rise up to this challenge, because the more we operate on this assumption that we live in this system of equality and it should just be as it is, the more we are lying to ourselves, because it's not true. We do not live in a system of equality. The very laws that are made in this country are built on racism. Look at your own rule book. And I think we need to engage in a process of structural reform to ensure that whoever is whoever, and however people want to identify, that's okay. And we should be fine with that.
We've got a question down the front here.
Thank you. My question is for Tila and Clementine. You touched on a little bit in the discussion that the justice system that we have, the basic principles are built on we are all assumed innocent unless proven, and the examination and cross-examination of the evidence. But in cases like sexual assault, these principles, I argue that they really disadvantage the victims, and because it's unlike a robbery, sexual assault has a psychological component to it, and this causes many victims or survivors don't come to report in the first place. So what can we do about it? Because it's not like we can change the legal system that's been around for forever.
I think that this was kind of the conundrum that we ended up settling on when we first had the discussion, that no one, I mean, from my perspective, one of the reasons why it's so hard to prosecute sexual assault, even if the survivors of it do make a report, or in the circumstances that they do make a report, is that fundamentally people don't want to believe that the men who perpetrate sexual assaults could be guilty of them, because most of those men do not come from. Most of those men are surrounded by community members who support and advocate for them. And I think that, it also speaks to, if you take it out of the legal system, it also speaks to a much broader expectation that women absorb the pain and anger and anguish and rage of men as a rule, as part of the labour that we're expected to do, so as not to impact their life in any way. I don't know how to make that system easier to navigate for survivors. And again, I just come back to maybe the better approach is to try and change the patterns of learning that create perpetrators. The association of sexual assault with a property crime is again, another inherent part of rape culture, is this idea and the argument that, if you leave your wallet on a windowsill, or if you leave your car unlocked and someone comes and steals it, can you really be surprised? And there's two things about that. Like, firstly, obviously your body is not a car, and you can't actually just leave it unlocked and walk away from it. But secondly, if you steal my car and I've left it unlocked, you've still committed a crime. You've still broken the law. It doesn't, just because I've left my car unlocked doesn't mean that you're allowed to come and take it now. Oh, well, she left the car unlocked. He's allowed. That's in the rule book. And I just think that people are very, I personally think that one of the reasons why people are so hesitant to force men who make up the majority of perpetrators of sexual assault, to force them to be accountable for their actions, is because maybe there's things that they've done that could be. I think it's very difficult for men to address maybe some of the actions of themselves in the past. The times that they might have coerced someone, or the times that they might have pushed and pushed and pushed until that no became a yes. Or that they might have actively assaulted someone. I mean, I know so many women, the majority of women I know have been sexually assaulted in some form or another. So how is it not true then that the majority of men I know, or at least a proportion of men I know, have been guilty of perpetrating those sexual assaults? They almost certainly have, and that's a really terrifying thing for people to confront, that it's not that, you know, people who perpetrate sexual assaults they're not external to us, they're people we know, and they're people we like.
Petra?
That is complex too, because in fact the data shows that the same man rapes many women. So women who have been raped aren't all raped by different men. Men tend to be serial rapists and serial abusers, and so I don't think it's a one-to-one distribution. It's true that most women we know have experienced some form of sexual assault. Most women I know have experienced some form of sexual assault, but there is, and I think we need to differentiate between perpetrators. So violent stranger rape is different to rape by somebody who's known, and then there's the fact that. Yeah, I think it is.
I don't know, because I'm
not saying it's worse or better, I'm just saying it's qualitatively different. And we're talking about perpetrators now. And what I'm saying is that the perpetrators are sometimes, not sometimes rather, there is research evidence to show that there's perpetrators that re-offend. For example, the man who murdered Jill Meagher had already raped and violated multiple sex workers. Had he been properly charged, he would be in prison. The same man is doing that. So I think we need to be careful around the one-to-one assumption, because most women we know, but therefore most men we know.
But I think one of the problems is that serial sex offenders are actually not the men who perpetrate sexual assaults against the women that they know necessarily. So, I know you're not saying that one is worse than the other, but I recall listening to a lawyer who worked for the UN talking about, a judge once making the argument that, of course, and she was working on rape as a crime of war, and she would listen to this judge talking about how, well, of course, being raped in war is much worse than, being raped by someone you know. And she observed, I thought quite correctly, well, I don't know, is it worse to be raped in a situation like that, or to be raped by your husband, someone who you meant to trust? And I think that one of the problems is that people differentiate and they say, well, someone like Adrian Bailey, well, that's a real rapist because he raped strangers, and he did it with extreme physical brutality.
I think that's the core point, the extreme physical brutality. Murder.
But at the same time, someone who violates you, who you know, or who what about the young woman in Balmoral who was raped in a caravan by two of her male friends, and they recently were sentenced to prison, and she's had to leave the small town. It's a tiny town of a few hundred people. She's had to leave the small town because the town turned completely against her. And how dare she bring a case against these two boys? And the football teams made sure to say to them, well, don't worry, you've got a spot on the team when you get out of prison. And she's living elsewhere, suffering from extreme post-traumatic stress disorder.
Clem, I hate to silence you, darling, but I'm getting the major wind up here.
Can I make one point?
Yes, you can, as long as it's brief.
Yes. So, back to your question, and particularly from my role in the community as a lawyer, I do think that the legal system is limited in this context. But it brings me back to the question, what does justice mean in this context to the victim? What's going to help the victim heal? And what's going to rehabilitate and address the behaviour of the alleged perpetrator or the convicted person? And Clementine made one point at the beginning, and that was about, is the criminal law the vehicle to be imposing these punishments, for example, is prison the option? Is that actually even going to address this conduct? Because it's not a deterrent. It's not. The behaviour keeps happening. We see it daily. Clementine also made another point earlier, which was, is the civil realm an option, which is not necessarily a prison punishment, but, in the civil jurisdiction, you can get compensation, for example, for your loss or for the personal injury that has been caused. I think we could have a whole day talking about this, but to leave it there, I think really, what does justice mean in this context for the victim?
Thank you, Tila. Well, I think Tila's summed it up very nicely. We could have a whole day on all of this. And the large question that was put in the title of tonight's event is feminism, what is there left to do? And I guess we've had our answer, and that is quite a lot, actually. So I'll just want to finish by thanking our speakers. Please raise your hands, and thanking all of our speakers. I'd like to thank La Trobe University for hosting this event tonight, particularly to Robert Mann for coming up with the topic in the first place and inviting all of our guests this evening, and to Alice Turnbull, who is Robert's offsider, who has organised the event so beautifully tonight. Thanks to all the La Trobe staff and students and volunteers who have worked this event tonight, and to Readings for Selling Books out the front. So,
Thanks to Claire as well.
Thank
it's
you,
all
Claire.
good.